All right, today we are diving deep into the super controversial trial of Reverend Sun Myung Moon, and we're going to do it using his own autobiography as our guide. This is a story about faith, it's about money, and it's about a huge debate over freedom that actually landed a major religious leader in a federal prison. So you gotta ask, right? How on earth does a tax issue, over a pretty small amount of money, by the way, explode into this massive nationwide debate about religious freedom? That is the question at the heart of this whole thing. And to really get Reverend Moon's side of it, we need to try and see the world the way he saw it. Long before any lawyers got involved, Moon describes this powerful wave of opposition that was building against him. As his Unification Church started getting bigger and more influential in America back in the 70s, he says the number of his critics, and just how intense they were, grew right along with it. Now, according to Reverend Moon, this opposition wasn't just coming from one little corner of society. Not at all. He saw this incredibly wide, almost unbelievable range of groups that he felt were all lined up against him. I mean, just look at this list from his book. You've got leftists and conservatives, established churches, the media, and even the parents of his own followers. It's everybody. So he basically breaks all this down into two main camps. First up, you have the political opposition. He was fiercely anti-communist, and he very publicly supported President Nixon during the whole Watergate scandal. And as he tells it, that put a huge target on his back from the media and the political left. But then there was the second front, the theological one. And this, he believed, is where the really deep-seated hostility came from. Yeah, from Moon's point of view, this theological fight was the real engine, driving what he saw as straight-up persecution. For him, this wasn't just about politics or what people thought of him. He was convinced the conflict was about the very core of his religious teachings, and it challenged the very foundations of established religion. And here it is. This was an absolute bombshell for mainstream Christianity. Moon taught that Jesus' crucifixion was actually a tragic failure, a setback, not the ultimate fulfillment of God's plan. That was a radical, radical departure from 2,000 years of doctrine. He was sure that this reinterpretation is what made the established religious powers see him as a dangerous enemy. This quote from his autobiography just sums it all up perfectly, doesn't it? That one idea, that single concept, challenged everything. And according to Moon, this theological threat was so huge that it actually united groups that would normally never agree on anything, like mainstream Christian churches and the Jewish community, all in opposition to him. So with all that as the backdrop, this coordinated hostility he was describing from both political and religious corners, the fight finally moves out of the court of public opinion and into an actual, literal court of law. And the charge that was brought against him would really put the boundary between church and state to the test. So what was the big crime he was finally charged with? After all that, it wasn't heresy, it wasn't some kind of political crime, it was something way more ordinary: tax evasion. The U.S. government decided the way to get him was through his wallet, not directly through his beliefs. And get this, the amount of money at the center of this huge national controversy was honestly tiny. The entire government case was built on unpaid taxes on just $7,500. And that was the interest that had built up in a bank account over a 3-year period. Just $7,500. Okay, so here's the absolute core of the legal battle. Moon's whole defense was, hey, that money wasn't even mine. It belonged to the church. He argued that it was being held in trust, and that putting church funds in a leader's personal account was a pretty common practice in a lot of denominations. But the prosecution, they saw it totally differently. They said, nope, it's in your bank account, you control it, you can spend it. And to them, that made the interest personal, taxable income. Well, his defense didn't sway the jury. They sided with the prosecution. Reverend Moon was found guilty and sentenced to 18 months in a federal prison. So, on the night before he had to report, he gathered thousands of his followers for one last, very defiant speech. This timeline really shows you how fast everything happened, from the indictment to him actually going to prison. And on that final night of freedom, standing in front of all those followers, he gave a speech that would completely reframe this whole ordeal, not as a personal loss, but as something else entirely. He started out with this simple, unwavering declaration. He looked out at this crowd, which he said was just heartbroken, and told them flat out, "I'm not a criminal, I am innocent." And then came the line, the one that became the defining, iconic moment of this whole affair. He completely flipped the script. He turned his personal sentence into a national crisis. He basically told his followers, "Don't feel sorry for me. Feel sorry for America," painting his imprisonment as a sign that the country had lost its spiritual way. And wow, that speech, casting his trial as this grand battle for America's soul, it had a huge and immediate impact. It sparked this wave of support that started coming from some very, very surprising places in the religious community. In response, this incredibly diverse group of religious leaders, we're talking Baptists, Catholics, Muslims, you name it, they formed something called the Common Suffering Fellowship. Now, these people didn't necessarily agree with Moon's theology, not at all, but they were really worried that his conviction represented a dangerous overreach of government power. They saw it as a threat to religious freedom for everyone. And so, in his own telling of this story, he didn't go to prison like a convicted felon. He writes that he walked into that Danbury prison with my head held high, totally convinced that his personal suffering had successfully kicked off a much larger, much more important national fight. And that brings us right back to the big, thorny question that this whole case leaves us with, a question people still argue about today. To Reverend Moon and all his supporters, the answer was obvious, but for so many others, that line is still really blurry. When does prosecuting a financial crime cross over into persecuting a religious belief? And that is what makes the Danbury trial such a fascinating and important story, even all these years later.